Joshua opens up with God commissioning a new leader. This new leader obviously was Joshua, but he had had a long road to get to where he was today. So a little bit of background about the Israelites and Joshua himself. So as you remember, the Israelites used to be slaves in Egypt. God called Moses to be their leader. Moses went to the Pharaoh and the Egyptian people and said, "Let my people go." And Moses several times said, "No, I will not let your people go." So God sent plagues, and all the plagues happened, and finally Pharaoh eventually said, "Okay, leave." So the Israelite people began to leave, and then right at the time that they started to leave, Pharaoh changed his mind again and chased after the Israelite people. This is where we see God do another miracle by parting the Red Sea for the Israelite people. One of the biggest miracles we remember about the Old Testament, right? God splitting the Red Sea. Well, as God splits the Red Sea, the Israelites go through on dry ground, and just in time the Egyptians come, and right when all the Egyptians are in the sea, God makes the waters go back over and kills all the Egyptians. And the Israelites go into the Promised Land free and no longer slaves. That wasn't the end of their journey though, right? They began to wander in the desert for 40 years because they were disloyal, they were disobedient, and they couldn't follow God's instructions. So God led them on this roundabout chase for 40 years in the desert till all of that generation dies out, and then the next generation would have their chance to receive the promised land that God promised to Abraham. It's at this point in the story where we see Joshua and the Israelites pick up. God's commissioning a new leader, and they at this point have a chance to obey God and enter into the promised land. So we see that God begins to do miracles in the life of the Israelite people once again, and he begins to part the seas, he begins to part the waters, he begins to perform miracles on their behalf because of their obedience to what God had called them to do. Now as they stand on the edge of the promised land, God ushers in this new leader. He commissions Joshua. He says, "My hand is upon him, just like my hand was upon Moses." And the people had to choose, are we going to obey this new leader like we did Moses, or are we going to depart from our God? And we see that the people choose correctly. They choose to obey God in their new endeavor. We see that Joshua has been a servant to Moses for many years. If you read our background verses that I posted several weeks ago, you'll know that he's been by Moses' side for so many things. On Mount Sinai, attacking other armies and bringing victory to the Israelite people. He was one of the spies that first went out when he was about 40 years old to spy out the promised land the first time before they wandered in the desert for 40 years. So if you add all those things up, now we see that Joshua is about 80 years old when God commissions him to be the leader. I think there's a lesson in that for our older ladies in our group, right? That we are never finished until God calls us home. This new leader, 80 years old, for you young whippersnappers, sometimes it takes a little growing to become a leader also. He's proven faithful. He's proven faithful to be by Moses' side. He's proven trustworthy to do as God has called him to do and serve the Israelite people. Now there's a few things that we need to remember about Joshua before we just jump right in and dive into our reading. Because if we don't know these things, they're going to be a bit confusing. First of all, I want you to remember that this is a primitive time. This is real historic events that took place. These aren't just stories. They aren't just made up fables. This is real history that took place in the lives of real people. It was in primitive times, and there are a lot of things that are going to take place that have to do with war, that have to do with the culture of this time, that we're going to read about, that we're not really going to understand because of the time and the setting and the culture in which we live. So the more we dig and the more we realize and the more we read history about the background of what's going on during this time, the more we'll understand it. But we need to remember that it was a primitive time. And if God's people were not willing to wage war against a pagan primitive culture, God's people would have been wiped off the face of the earth. Now I'm saying all that to you because in the pages ahead, we're going to see a lot of war, a lot of destruction, a lot of killing of animals and people, and we need to remember that it was a different time and a different place. Now the next thing that I want you to remember is that Joshua is actually the Hebrew name translated into Greek is Jesus. And so a lot of study has been done on the book of Joshua that parallels and prophesies to the New Testament, to the new Jesus, this new Savior that is being brought into the New Testament. And there's a lot of prophecy that goes into the book of Joshua. Now I want you to know I am no expert on the prophecies of the Old Testament. So we're going to hit on some of those things, but we're definitely not going to be diving deep into those things. If you're interested in that, I've got some great resources as we go along that I would love to share with you. Some great sermons and by some great theologians that can offer some really deep insight into the prophecies that parallel Joshua with Jesus and the coming Messiah. Now, with that being said, it's also important to remember that because we need to remember that this land of Canaan, which is the promised land, is God's destination for his people to experience freedom. Freedom from years of slavery, freedom from years of not being under his leadership, years apart from his hand of protection and rest and blessings. But we see a whole generation holding on to their past, not wanting to move on to what God has for them in the future. And because of this, they are stopped short from the fullness of God's blessing. Even Moses, their trusted leader, did not get to enter into the promised land because of his disobedience to God. And as we read the scriptures this week, we have to reflect upon that question in our own life. The deliverance from their slavery in Egypt was to be severed completely so they could fully enjoy the abundant life God had prepared for them in Canaan. The same is true for you and I. We will have to sever ties completely with the sin of this world, the sin of our own past, maybe relationships, maybe old habits, whatever it is that God is calling us to sever ties with. I promise you, my friend, it will be worth it because on the other side is God's promised land, our own Canaan that he has waiting for us. And if we're holding on to the past, we will never fully enjoy and live in the freedom and the blessings that God has for us. So that's my prayer for us this week, that as we read chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4 of Joshua, that we will begin to see that God has so much in store for us than we ever could think or ever imagine. Happy reading, my friends. I look forward to hearing from all of you about what God is teaching you, the things and the encouragement that you're getting to let go of the past and move forward with God in your relationship.